On a rainy night, an experienced truck driver accepts a load on a little-traveled route surrounded by dark legends. What seemed to be just another routine trip quickly turns into a nightmare when he begins to notice strange phenomena along the way. The road, known for inexplicable disappearances and paranormal events, holds secrets that have long been buried. As he continues, the trucker finds himself trapped in a deadly game, where each mile could be his last. What really lurks in the darkness of this cursed road? And more importantly, will he survive to find out? The rain pounded the truck's windshield, turning the asphalt into a black, treacherous mirror. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, revealing a deserted, never-ending road. Eduardo, a truck driver with decades of experience, had never been bothered by storms or lonely nights on the road, but this night was different. There was something in the air, an uneasiness he couldn't explain. The constant sound of the rain on the cab's roof, usually comforting, now seemed like a sinister symphony hammering at his mind. Accepting that last-minute load hadn't been his best decision, but the money offered was irresistible, and the route, though isolated, was short. Eduardo had heard the stories about the dark road, but he always treated them as roadside legends, exaggerated tales to scare the younger drivers. Unexplained disappearances, truckers who were never seen again, mysterious lights in the sky. It was all just folklore, or at least that's what he told himself. As he drove down the road, the truck's radio began to fail, emitting only static. Eduardo tried adjusting the knobs, but nothing seemed to work. Suddenly, a shadow crossed the road ahead, too fast to be a common animal. He braked sharply, the truck skidding slightly on the wet asphalt, but when he looked again, there was nothing there. Only dense, impenetrable darkness. Eduardo's heart raced. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "It's okay, it's just my mind playing tricks on me," he thought. But a sense of unease grew within him, as if something was watching, waiting. The rain seemed to get heavier, each drop reverberating like a drum inside the cab. The clock on the dashboard read midnight, but time seemed to be dragging on. As the journey continued, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, each mile identical to the last. Eduardo began to notice that the fuel was running out faster than usual. He had filled up completely before leaving, but the needle on the gauge was dangerously close to the red. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the dashboard. He couldn't remember the last time he saw a gas station, and the thought of running out of fuel in the middle of that deserted road began to haunt him. Then he saw the lights. Small, bright points on the horizon, flickering as if they were lanterns in a distant procession. Eduardo felt a momentary relief, thinking it might be a small town or at least a village. But as he got closer, the lights didn't seem natural. They floated in the air, moving irregularly, as if they had a will of their own. A chill ran down his spine, and he accelerated, trying to leave those lights behind. For a brief moment, everything seemed to return to normal. The radio, which had been dead until then, came back on, playing an old song, the kind Eduardo remembered hearing in his childhood. But then, the melody began to distort, the singer's voice taking on a dark, almost demonic tone. Eduardo turned off the radio with a jolt, his heart now pounding in his chest. He looked in the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. The lights were behind him, getting closer. He couldn't tell if they were in the air or if they were headlights from another vehicle, but the speed at which they were approaching was inhuman. Eduardo pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the truck seemed to struggle against something invisible, as if the road itself was trying to hold him back. The rain was now so intense that he could barely see, but stopping wasn't an option. Those lights were not from friends. The road began to narrow, and the trees on the sides seemed to close in on him, their branches cracking and scratching against the truck's metal. Eduardo began to sweat, despite the cold that was creeping into the cab. He knew he had to get out of there, but there was no escape, only that cursed road stretching as far as his eyes could see. And then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Eduardo tried to swerve, but it was too late. The truck passed through the body as if it were made of smoke, but Eduardo felt the impact, a dull thud that reverberated through the cab. He braked hard, the truck skidding to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening. The rain, the lights, the noises, everything vanished. Eduardo was alone, trapped on a road that no longer made sense. He looked around, but all he could see was darkness and an empty road that seemed never to have been used. Whatever was out there was now inside him, in his mind, in his fear. But this was only the beginning. The true nature of the dark road had yet to reveal itself, and Eduardo knew it wouldn't be something he could easily forget. He needed to find out what was happening before it was too late. Eduardo kept his hands steady on the wheel, trying to control the tremor that ran up his arms. He wasn't sure what had just happened. His mind tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure on the road, the impact he felt, and now, the absolute void. There was no more rain, the lights had disappeared, and the radio remained silent. The only thing he could hear was the heavy, irregular breathing inside the cab. He knew he needed to get out of there, but his instincts screamed not to go forward. The silence was unsettling, but staying still seemed even worse. With a deep sigh, Eduardo turned the key in the ignition, and the truck's engine roared in response. He accelerated slowly, his eyes alert for any sign of danger. The road ahead seemed to stretch into a dark tunnel, the trees arching above him, as if they wanted to cover the moon and stars. After a few minutes of almost unbearable tension, Eduardo spotted something ahead, by the side of the road. It was a gas station, old and dimly lit, but it seemed like his only hope. The fuel pumps were covered in rust, and the sign flickered intermittently, as if it was on the verge of going out for good. He pulled the truck up to one of the pumps and got out, hesitant. The air was cold, almost icy, and he felt a shiver run down his spine as he walked towards the small convenience store. The door creaked loudly as he opened it. The interior was dark, except for a faint light at the back of the counter. Empty, dusty shelves indicated that this place hadn't seen visitors in a long time. Eduardo approached the counter, but no one was there. A rusty bell was there, as if waiting for him to ring it, but Eduardo hesitated. Something about this place felt deeply wrong. Before he could decide what to do, a deep, raspy voice came from the darkness behind the counter. "Need help with the road, son?" Eduardo jumped, startled. An old man emerged from the shadows, his eyes dark and full of secrets. He wore a dirty coverall, and his face was partially hidden by a gray, disheveled beard. I just need fuel," Eduardo replied, trying to stay calm. The old man looked at him for a long moment, as if assessing his soul. "Are you sure you want to continue down this road?" he asked, his voice heavy with a gravity that made Eduardo's stomach turn. Few who go on ever come back to tell the tale. Eduardo tried to ignore the fear growing inside him. "I don't have a choice," he replied, trying to sound firm. The old man nodded slowly, as if he already knew what the answer would be. "Very well," he said, with a tone of resignation. "The pump is working. But be careful, son. What you've encountered so far is just the beginning. The road will test you, and the price for continuing may be too high." Eduardo felt a lump in his throat, but there was no turning back. He thanked the man, paid for the fuel, and returned to the truck. As he filled the tank, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He looked around, but there was nothing but darkness and the eerie gas station. When he finished, he quickly got back into the cab and revved the engine, eager to get away from that place. But as he drove back onto the road, something in the rearview mirror caught his attention. The station's lights were going out, one by one, until everything around him was again swallowed by darkness. Eduardo looked ahead, but the old gas station was no longer there. It was as if it had never existed. The road ahead seemed narrower and more winding than before, and the trees, denser, formed a tunnel of shadows. Eduardo felt the weight of the silence, but he knew he wasn't alone. With each mile he traveled, the air grew heavier, and a growing sense of dread enveloped him. The old man's words echoed in his mind. "The road will test you." Suddenly, the radio came to life with a loud crackle, making Eduardo nearly lose control of the wheel. The static filled the air for a few seconds until a voice began to emerge from the noise, muffled and distant, as if it were coming from another world. "You shouldn't be here." Eduardo's heart nearly stopped. He twisted the knobs, trying to tune into another station, but the voice continued, repeating the same words. "You shouldn't be here." It was as if the road was speaking to him, trying to warn him or, worse, threaten him. Eduardo felt panic rising. There was no way back, but moving forward seemed increasingly unbearable. He sped up, hoping to leave that voice behind, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly, growing more oppressive by the second. The forest around him closed in, and the air was so heavy it was hard to breathe. And then, in the distance, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the middle of the road stood a figure, motionless, as if waiting for him. Eduardo slowed down, his eyes locked on the silhouette ahead. As he got closer, the figure became clearer. It was the same man he had run over minutes earlier, now standing, staring directly at him. Eduardo's throat tightened. He knew this wasn't possible, that it wasn't real, but there he was, blocking the way, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Eduardo braked, the truck stopping just a few meters from the figure. The silence was total, except for the sound of the engine still running. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then, without warning, the figure started to approach, slowly and deliberately. Eduardo wanted to reverse, to flee, but his hands were frozen on the wheel, unable to react. The figure came closer until its face was almost touching the windshield. Eduardo could see the details of its pale skin, the lifeless, empty eyes, and the sinister smile forming on its lips. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, its voice now clear and distinct. That's when the truck's lights failed, plunging everything into complete darkness. Eduardo let out a choked scream, and at that moment the truck jerked as if it had been hit by something. The lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. Eduardo's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He had no choice. He needed to get off this road, no matter what. Putting the truck in gear, Eduardo stomped on the accelerator with all his might. The truck roared, and he sped down the road, ignoring the potholes, the curves, and the terror growing inside him. But as he drove, a cold, mocking voice echoed in his mind. "The road will test you, Eduardo, and the price might be more than you're willing to pay." He didn't know what awaited him in the next few miles, but one thing was certain. He was in a fight for his sanity, and maybe for his life. Eduardo drove like his life depended on it, and maybe it really did. The truck sped down the winding road, the engine roaring under the strain. The landscape around him blurred, trees and shadows blending into a scene that seemed more like a nightmare than reality. Every sharp turn seemed to lead to a new descent into the unknown, and the darkness around was so thick it seemed to have weight. For a moment, he thought he had left everything behind. The figure on the road, the voice on the radio, the old man at the gas station. It all seemed like a momentary madness. But as he continued driving, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Eduardo glanced nervously at the mirrors, but saw nothing but darkness. Still, he felt, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that something was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Then it happened again. The radio, which had been silent since the last incident, crackled, and the voice returned, now clearer and closer. "You shouldn't be here, Eduardo." This time, there was no static, just that phrase repeated in a whisper that seemed to invade his thoughts. Eduardo tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the voice intensified, repeating the words like a sinister mantra. "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the truck started losing power. The engine, once powerful and reliable, began to sputter, emitting strange sounds as if it were being strangled. Eduardo pressed down hard on the accelerator, but the speed dropped sharply. The truck was slowing down, as if an invisible force was pulling it back. Fear gripped him. Whatever was on the road, it didn't want him to escape. With no options, he veered the truck onto the shoulder and stopped. Eduardo's breathing was ragged, and sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cold that filled the cab. He knew he had to get out of there, but the old man's words echoed in his mind. "The road will test you." Eduardo opened the cab door, stepping out into what seemed like the darkest night of his life. The air was heavy, laden with a metallic smell he couldn't identify. The forest around was a wall of shadows, and the silence was so absolute that every step he took seemed to echo into eternity. Eduardo walked to the front of the truck, hoping to find some explanation for the mechanical failure, but what he saw left him paralyzed. Scratched into the truck's metal, as if gouged by giant claws, were words that made Eduardo's stomach churn. "No escape." He stepped back, nearly tripping as his mind tried to process what he was seeing. How was this possible? Who or what could have done this? Fear turned to panic when he realized that the words weren't just on the truck. They were also on the asphalt, on the surrounding trees, written on every visible surface, like a sentence encircling him. Eduardo ran back to the cab, his hands trembling as he tried to start the engine again. The truck roared to life, but the words kept echoing in his mind, like a curse he couldn't shake off. He pressed down on the accelerator, desperately trying to get back on the road, but the path ahead seemed to be changing. The road, once familiar, was now a spiral of impossible curves, a labyrinth pulling him deeper into darkness. Every mile seemed to drive him further into a nightmare. The road grew narrower, the trees closing in around him like the walls of a prison. Eduardo could feel the presence of shadows around him, figures lurking between the trunks and whispering his name. He knew he couldn't stop. Stopping would mean surrendering, and he couldn't allow that. Exhaustion began to overtake Eduardo. His eyes were heavy, and his mind was starting to falter. The road ahead of him twisted, as if moving of its own accord, leading him to a destination he couldn't see but feared deeply. The shadows seemed closer now, almost tangible, as if trying to grab him, pull him out of reality. Suddenly, the truck emerged from a bend, and Eduardo saw a light in the distance. It was faint but clear, cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. He sped up, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and desperation. Maybe, finally, he was reaching the end of this cursed road. But as he got closer, the light revealed something that made Eduardo slam on the brakes. The road ahead ended abruptly at a cliff, and the light came from a solitary beacon perched on top of a precipice that fell into a black abyss. There was no path, no bridge, just emptiness in front of him. Eduardo got out of the truck, his legs shaking as he approached the edge of the cliff. He looked down but saw only darkness, a darkness that seemed to stretch on infinitely. The road had brought him here, but why? For what? That's when he heard it. Coming from behind him, the sound of slow, dragging footsteps. Eduardo turned slowly, and there, emerging from the shadows, was the figure he had seen earlier on the road. It walked toward him, eyes fixed on him, and that macabre smile on its lips. Eduardo took a step back, feeling the void right behind him. He was cornered, with no way out. The figure approached, and Eduardo knew, with terrifying certainty, that this was no person but something much older and malevolent, something that belonged to this road since time immemorial. The figure stopped a few meters from Eduardo. The smile disappeared, and the eyes, once empty, were now filled with a deep, eternal darkness. "You shouldn't be here," it said, in a voice that echoed like thunder in Eduardo's mind. He felt the ground beneath his feet begin to give way. The cliff was crumbling, pulling him into the abyss. Eduardo tried to run, but the figure was everywhere, around him, inside him, like a shadow he could never escape. And then the darkness swallowed him. What Eduardo saw in that last moment, what he felt as he fell into the void, will never be known. The road had claimed its final price, and the mystery of the dark road remained, waiting for its next victim. Darkness was all that was left. Eduardo was falling, feeling the void consume every fragment of his existence. The cold wind cut his skin as he was pulled into the abyss, endless and hopeless. There was no more road, no truck, not even fear. Everything he knew, everything he was, disintegrated as he plunged deeper into the darkness. But then, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the absolute void, a faint light began to shine in the distance. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it slowly grew, like a star rising on the horizon of an endless night. Eduardo, feeling the last thread of his consciousness cling to that light, reached out, even if it was a futile gesture. As the light grew, Eduardo began to feel something different. The sensation of falling diminished, and the darkness around him started to recede, like a curtain being drawn back. He felt his feet touch solid ground, and the emptiness around him slowly dissipated, revealing a familiar landscape, the road. He was back, standing beside the truck, but everything felt different. The road was now calm, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon breaking through the clouds. A gentle breeze blew, carrying with it the scent of the forest. Eduardo looked around, dazed, trying to understand what had happened. The truck was intact, without a scratch, as if the nightmare he had endured wasn't real. But something had changed. Eduardo knew deep down that he was no longer the same man who had started that journey. He felt like something had been left behind, a part of himself that would never return. The road had taken something from him, but it had also given him a second chance, an escape he couldn't explain. Without wasting time, Eduardo climbed into the truck's cab and turned the ignition key. The engine purred softly, and he began to drive, feeling the weight of what had happened still present, yet strangely distant. The road ahead was now straight and clear, without shadows or sinister bends. He drove in silence, with the radio off, and the darkness finally fading behind him. In the distance, the lights of a small town appeared, warm and familiar. Eduardo accelerated, eager to leave the dark road behind. When he finally reached the town's entrance, he let out a sigh of relief. He was safe and sound, but he knew that road would never leave his mind. Eduardo parked the truck at a gas station, this time real and full of life. He stepped out, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet and the cool breeze on his face. As he walked to the counter to pay for the fuel, a familiar voice greeted him. "Good evening, young man. Tough route, isn't it?" said the attendant, an elderly man with a familiar look. Eduardo froze for a moment, his heart racing. But as he looked closely, he saw that this man was different. His eyes were kind, and his smile comforting. "Yeah, tough, but I'm ready to move on," Eduardo replied, with a faint smile. He paid for the fuel, thanked the man, and returned to the truck. As he drove away, the town's lights flickering in the rearview mirror, Eduardo knew this would not be the last journey he would make. But now, he carried with him the memory of a night when he faced something beyond comprehension and survived. The dark road would continue to exist, a legend born of ancient mysteries, waiting for those who dared to travel it. And for Eduardo, that would be the last load he would haul on that route. Whatever lurked in the darkness, he had overcome it, at least for now.